Hi there, my name is Stephen Chow. I want to welcome you to the first Sibos Game Changer. Now, this program looks at the innovations and current talking points in the banking industry, and we will broadcast to you at 1 p.m. every day. Our first game changer is Alan Labouche, Director at Financial Network Analytics. And later on Sibos, well, Alan, you'll be giving a talk, Risk Management in the Age of Disruption. Tell us a bit more about that. What are you hoping to cover during that session?
Sure. So the main point is that we're in a big age of disruption, right? So it's driven by exponential changes, exponential technology, as well as exponential changes in our environment, right? So the world is getting ever more complex and fast-paced, and that changes the way that we make decisions, that we manage risk. You know, traditional methods that work in stable environments like predict and control just don't work anymore. Just too many different pieces are interacting with each other. So you take Singapore, for example, right? As a city, we could try to build a really complex model to forecast the traffic and have it run on a supercomputer. And then, you know, a dog runs out in front of the presidential motorcade, changes everything, right? That dog was not in the model, right? So the point is that we cannot build, you know, super complex models to forecast everything. What we need to do is realize that in a complex world, there's so many different pieces that work together, that interact, and sometimes in very unexpected ways. And sometimes paradoxically as well, safety mechanisms, security mechanisms actually trigger a cascading failure, right? So what we do is we need to be much better at sensing and responding to changes and using networked intelligence, right? So from an overall organizational perspective, we're moving from the centralized predict and control, which works well for stable environments, to much more nimble networked sense and respond using dynamic steering, like riding a motorbike.
So in a way you're saying it needs to be customized for each and every situation, but at the same time, you can't create 1,000 different templates and say, we've got it all covered, because none of them are structured in stone, and it will change. So how has that really changed the way one approaches risk management, with the fact that you're saying now that everything is evolving, and how do you cater for every different scenario? Because that's virtually impossible.
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, the key thing is just to recognize that our models have a lot that's missing, right? And so that we need to look out at the world, look outside our institution, and see what's emerging that's new. What are some exponential trends maybe that are very small at this point in time, but that might affect us in the future.
So it's a bit of crystal ball gazing. You're saying look ahead and say what could happen, what could be the different scenarios, the different kinds of dogs that jump in, or cats. And
yeah, it's look ahead and also look at the periphery. Look at what's happening outside the network. And this is something that's also very interesting. Vinod Khosla gave a talk at the Stanford GSB a couple months ago, and his quote really resonated with me, which is that, you know, all the interesting things happen at the periphery of the network, where there's a lot of uncertainty and volatility, not at the solid core, right? So that's where that innovation is happening. So what you want to do is you want to go away from the core, from your own organization, which a lot of banks in particular are very internally focused, because they're very big, complex institutions, difficult to manage. And yet on the outside world, there are some things going on in Palo Alto that might completely change everything. And the big banks are noticing that already, right?
But again, from their point of view, you're saying don't look at their core, but that is why it's called their core business. That is their mainstay, that's their paycheck. You know, so they have to focus on that. And everything else, in a way, is it really that important? You're saying it is.
Yeah, it is, because what can happen is that technology can come from the periphery and completely transform what is the core right now. Take, for example, robo-advisors, right? Right now, robo-advisors are only targeting the smallest part of banking business. Most banks are not interested in that kind of tiny amount of asset. And so they're sort of moving up higher, and what will happen is this process of disruptive innovation that Clayton Christensen talks about, where once this disruptive innovation takes a foothold somewhere and can then develop, the solution will become more and more powerful, right? So for example, this emergence of artificial intelligence in finance can be incredibly disruptive. Now what we think, though, back to your discussion about the dashboards, right? We're not believers in pure AI. AI is going to keep developing. AI will drive cars better than us. AI will be able to construct portfolios that are more resilient than us. but there's still a role for the pilot, right? So what we believe is you want to build dashboards that give you updated information, that allow you to sense and respond, not just immediately what's in front of you, right? Or even look at the Google car.
Right.
What's good about that, it has sensors that looks at traffic conditions several blocks ahead in the entire area and can reroute you. With a lot more knowledge and perspective than you have just as an individual driver.
So not just artificial intelligence running things, but you're saying it's more as an assistive form of technology. It still needs to be run by a person.
Exactly. So it's about amplifying intelligence, right? So we need to recognize there's certain kinds of things machines do better than us, right? And we, no need for us to compete, but we can use that information. What we're good at, machines need a lot of data to detect patterns, right? We're really good at recognizing the situation has changed, right? So the analogy is that every plane has an autopilot, but also a pilot, right? That, when conditions get strange, there's a weather pattern, the pilot will take over, right? So that's that idea. How do you amplify intelligence between human and machine? And even more, how do you amplify intelligence between different teams of people, right? Because it's really about social intelligence. That's this critical part that is transforming the world, right?
So there's the question of cost benefit, because a lot of these things take a long investment period, a lot of money to invest in such technology to get it whereas at the point where you are describing, which is quite well, when it comes to that, it's really unique and individualized, in that sense. So is it worth for companies looking into that? Because again, they're thinking it's too long a gestation period.
Yeah, I think a lot of these tools are going to be really standardized. I remember when I started my career at JP Morgan, we were building all kinds of very sophisticated mortgage visualization tools, which, it all became standard part of Excel, right? So a lot of these technologies we can actually build on top of. And we're at that point where it's amazing what we can do. And actually, if I look back at the way that we used to manage risk in the 90s and now, in the 90s we had this amazing development of simulation technology, all this, supercomputers crunching, repricing mortgage securities, a lot of invention in derivatives and so on. It was a really, as a period which grew a lot, maybe too much, right? Where we became overconfident, right? And now we have different perspectives where, as opposed to just building really complex models, we realize there's a limitation in the models, right? Well, each model is just a model. We need to actually get a better sense of what reality is. So it's really building maps, right? So what we advocate doing is actually, it's like Google Maps.
Yeah,
right?
you have something called financial cartography, right?
Exactly.
So tell me a bit more about that and how it works.
Exactly. So the main point is that if you're in a challenging terrain, right, it helps to have a map that's updated and dynamic, right? So take London cabbies. They study the map, city map, for years and years. You can have an Uber driver who's never been to London with Google Maps outperform that cabbie without Google Maps, because Google Maps will tell you where there are road closures and so on, right? So the more dynamic an environment is, the more important it is to have these maps to guide us through preventing pitfalls and so on, right? So this is the same idea in finance, right? So that, maps amplify intelligence. And what you want to do is you want to be able to understand what is the interconnectivity as well, and you want to be able to communicate intuitively, right? So every war room has a map at the center, right, or command center. And you can sort of see, okay, our troops are there, their troops are there, our supply lines are there, here's some ships going, oh, something new just happened there. And everyone just intuitively knows how the battlefield is changing. So it can coordinate the social intelligence, right? So the same point here with financial data. We have so much financial data that's emerging, so much sensor information. Think of it as like traffic information. Every time someone buys and sells a security, that's a valuable signal. Why did someone buy Google and sell Apple, On an individual basis, a lot of that might be noise. Someone might just be rebalancing their portfolio. But if you see a lot of people doing something, if you see certain archetypal phase transition signals, a lot of instability and amplification, you know that, something is going on in China. There's a bubble emerging, and now something has changed. There's a regime shift, a dramatic transition. Being able to focus on that and focus the team on that so that everyone's looking at the same things and communicating about it, essentially serves as social intelligence amplification.
So with this platform, you're saying you can kind of almost predict what might be coming.
It's interesting. Prediction is difficult, so I'll say that, basically we're flying through the clouds mainly, right? But there's a lot more to risk than sort of the black swan theory, right? Every once in a while there's a black swan, an extreme event, no one saw it coming. That was not the case with the global financial crisis. There were clear warning signals. We have a simulation on our website that shows housing price changes over a decade. And you can play through this in about 5 minutes, and you will, just by looking at that data and seeing how that's connected, you will very, very clearly see how the bubble started to emerge in October 2003, kept on expanding. You saw the phase transition to a topping process in late 2005, 2006, and you saw the negative phase transition in July 2007. You saw that very, very clearly by looking at that data. And what it is what we're doing, we're really just displaying information. This is quarterly lag data, right? So what it is that everyone in a complex system, you cannot make long-term forecasts. There's a lot you don't know. There are too many, the dog that runs out in the street. No one can forecast that. But if we do sense that a dog ran in front of the street at a critical intersection, New York, in front of the Holland Tunnel, right at rush hour, we know most likely that'll be a traffic jam, and it'll probably span these kinds of blocks, and we probably can reroute in that way. So the ability, so essentially by observing like a mini black swan, an unusual, an outlier, something unusual, and seeing that this outlier cascades, we get this island of predictability.
So in other words, what happened in 2008, as you just described, there were signs pointing to what was about to come.
Oh, absolutely.
But yet, it still happened.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, there's a reason why JP Morgan got out in late 2006. There's a famous article, New York Times article by Joe Nocera about called Risk Mismanagement, talking about how Goldman actually got out of subprime in December 2006 by observing these outlier signals, right? At Morgan, one of the practices for us as risk managers was, we had VAR limits for all of our businesses, and our confidence level was 95%. So 1 in 20 days, 5% of the time, we expected to blow through, these VAR limits. And what we did was we'd get together, we say, okay, why was there VAR accession? And we're like, okay, something happened in emerging markets, okay. So then the question is this going to have a contagion effect? Is this signal a noise? Is this just a 1 out of 20 days that's what's happening or not? In the case of Goldman, or in many other cases, you see that this once a month meeting happened 10 days in a row at Goldman Sachs. So 10 days in a row, they were discussing their mortgage business. It wasn't that the mortgage market was cratering, just the movements were so unusual and amplifying, right? The interesting thing is the broad market did not detect anything was wrong. These securities, AAA rated securities, I wrote a case study about that, were trading at 15 basis points over a risk-free rate for 5-year duration instrument, right? AAA, right? So 15 basis point extra for AAA, back then it seemed good. The volatility was a fraction of a basis point, right? So we've had some clients who had these securities in their portfolio, and when I wrote this article, they're like, well, we never noticed this. Well, you didn't notice it because it was part of your larger portfolio, and because you didn't look at the fact that it mattered that volatility went from a half a basis point volatility to 1.5 basis points volatility. So these are really subtle signals, but Goldman knew these are the critical fault lines. So they're like sort of like, they had a seismograph, on the San Andreas fault line, and they realized that, this thing, if it blows, it could be huge. And then they noticed unusual market movements. And then they got out. And by the way, that didn't trigger any larger cascade. The market actually stabilized. It was only February 2008 when HSBC was the first firm to announce a $10.5 billion loss that this 15 basis point spread was still at 15 basis points. It went from 15 to 34. And then get this. Then people thought, well, this is great value. There's no way. These things are still rated AAA.
That's right. Let's get in and buy it now.
People went back in, right? And this traded back down to less than 20 basis points, about 17 basis points before, and then all this other stuff happened, right? New Century Financial.
But this could be a whole
defaulted.
bunch of things. I mean, for one, they didn't know the management was meeting every day for those 10 days. They weren't sitting in that room. So they get a sense, again, the general sentiment in the outlying environment, as you mentioned, could have still been bullish. People were still happy with the way things were. There was no inclination that a disaster was on the verge. So, I mean, these are things, again, that you can't predict human nature. And if everyone's happy, then you usually just go along with it.
Yeah, well what's interesting here is this concept again of outliers. You can learn a lot from outlier information, so observing unusual market movements, but as well people who have a different perspective, right? So, Robert Shiller is a perfect example. The academics are kind of at the periphery. They're not at the core of the financial system. So he's able to observe without talking his own book that, oh, it seems like we might be in a tech bubble, and sure enough we were. And it might be that we're in a housing bubble. Like, he's not selling any securities, or he has this independent view. And so what we think is very, very helpful is using actually this process that's very well known in Silicon Valley. It's this concept of the diffusion of disruptive innovation, right? When something new emerges, new technology is there, like let's say the telephone. At first it's dismissed as a toy and so on, but then eventually it's sort of visionaries come up with this concept, oh, we could have mobile phones and all be connected, and everyone laughs at them for a while. But then eventually you see an adoption. And when you see sort of the iPhone, Steve Jobs launched the iPhone 1, when you see the early adopters, right? Steve Jobs in a way would be this outlier, this guy in the periphery with crazy dreams, a lot of, who's this crazy hippie, thinking computers will change the world, thinking he can reinvent the mobile phone. But once you saw the adoption rates of the iPhone, original iPhone, you knew then that it was game over for Nokia, that there was going to be iPhone 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth, right? So those are the early adopters, right? So the critical thing is listen to the innovators, the outliers, the crazies that kind of put together things when, it's still in their head. Right. It's still in its invisible form, right? And a lot of innovators, right? There are a lot of people that are just as smart as Steve Jobs and Larry Page and Sergey Brin who have awesome ideas that might never come to fruition because the environment is not right, or it might come to fruition next year, right? So the critical point is you want to see when is the environment right for that, to confirm that. So in case of subprime, it was Rubini and Robert Shiller warning about the bubble from 2005 on, everyone saying, yeah, right, whatever, things are going good. If you had shorted the market back then, you would have lost money. The US equity market peaked in October 2007, by the way, right? Despite all of this stuff going on. But when you start to see folks like Goldman Sachs and other hedge funds starting to move in these tremors that are not just a one-time tremor, but that amplify, that's when you know something is going on. And that it's a matter of time before it goes to the rest of the ecosystem. Because people change their view very slowly, right? Yes. If you have a certain worldview and someone tells you your worldview is completely different, it takes us a long time to shift. We can shift our perspective by about 5% at a time.
Right.
So it takes
you got to meet a whole
time.
bunch of people back to back telling you your view is wrong,
But you need hard knocks of you operate in an environment and suddenly it's a different environment. Correct. You get surprised and eventually we learn, right? Okay. But it takes, we saw these early warning signals 4 to 7 months before the proper crisis started.
Well, let's talk then. Let's talk about moving forward. So that was what happened in the past. I mean, what have we learned from that? And with the way innovation is going, the formats of technology has changed so much. What can we do now to better prevent a similar scenario from occurring again? Are we at a stage where we are better managed in terms of risks? Right.
I think we've learned a lot, and we still have a lot to go. But what I think is really amazing is that we are now taking network perspectives, right? So this actually was my colleague Kimmo Soramaki, who founded FNA. He authored the first paper that mapped the major financial system, the Fedwire payment system, which was because of another kind of disruption, terrorism. The 2001 terrorist attacks made regulators realize, you know what, how resilient is our financial system? What could bring it down, right? And so Kimmo and his colleagues at the Fed mapped this. And since then, since the global financial crisis, regulators have realized, you know what, there's so much we don't even know about how all these banks are connected, these subsidiaries and so on. We need to map the financial system. And so Kimmo has worked with a lot of central banks to actually map this entire plumbing system. And here at SWIFT, we know how, how financial data flows, what are some critical nodes. Kimmo is now the editor of the Journal of Risk and Network Theory, and we've organized just our second conference at Cambridge University. At the first one, I was walking to the conference and speaking to a young PhD recent graduate who was working at the Central Bank of Mexico, asking about network theory, thinking, it's kind of a niche thing, probably a Bank of Mexico. He's like, you know what, there's only 2 of us in that department, but the maps that we've created now, the central bank governors that's the first thing they ask for. They want, when something goes on, they want to see, you know what, that institution, where is that connected to? There's a missed payment there, who else can be affected, right? So it makes regulators a lot more effective, right? So think about a very simple scenario. Let's say I owe you, $1,000. And you owe, someone else $1,000, and so on and so forth. But I don't pay you the $1,000, right? That means you don't have enough money in your pocket to pay the next and you can have a cascade from a very small amount of money. Let's say that you're a bank, all the banks are connected. You can have a similar situation where a major payment is missed, or one bank goes down, and then there's a cascade. And let's say that you have a limited amount of funds. You have $1 billion that you can use as the regulators. Where do you put it? Do you put it at the end of the chain or at the beginning, right? So knowing where a problem is in the system and very quickly going there, it can stop a forest fire.
Okay. And are we at the stage now where we can have those maps exist?
There are certain, Kimmo has worked with the Korean Central Bank, for example. They're getting live updated data on payments. The ECB, the Bank of England are very, very active users. We're working with several agencies in the United States as well. So there's a lot, of work going on in the regulatory community. I think it's hit that critical point. And now it's started as well in the private sector, right? Where I think that this is the issue with the private sectors. I think the banks have been overwhelmed by regulation and complexity, right? So that their risk management has become compliance, right? So the regulators are taking the big picture view, right? But the banks, in a way, are so, are so focused on their internal requirements, on having the wrong data, getting penalized for that. There's a lot of stress there, and they're not able to sort of look at the big picture as much. So I think this technology needs to go to the banks and be more widespread there. Asset managers and hedge funds have started to adopt this as well, because they're looking outside all the time, right? But I think with banks, there's a little bit too much of an internal compliance focus right now.
But I guess the thing is, with a link like that, it makes sense. In fact, when you say link, the world is linked in this day and age. It's not just the finance industry. It's just not just property, automobile. Everything's linked.
Yeah, that's
so
right. That's right.
Do we have a map of?
That's right. So great question. So we're working with the Cambridge Center for Risk Studies, which they do awesome things. They have this concept they call it catastronomics, right? And their overall point is that it's really important to study A, catastrophes, and B, financial crises. If you look at all the big things that go wrong, the cost of financial crises tops everything else. Wars, natural disasters. There's a huge cost to GDP from financial crises, right? So what they're doing is they're trying to come up with scenarios that link different systems being interconnected with each other. For example, what if China and Japan declared war with each other? That's one of their scenarios, right? How will that affect shipping lanes, logistics networks, financial markets, and long-term economic growth, right? What would happen if there was a slow burn cyber attack, right? That sort of very, very intelligently, affected certain systems with a delay and just changed a certain random variable, which then years later, there are manufacturing defaults that bring down planes and things like that. And like there can be these scenarios where you really need to be able to trace these links through these interconnected networks. So what Cambridge is focused on is how is one network connected to the next network, and so on.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking from a country's point of view, this was seemed like something on a political scale as well, because they would be wanting to risk or manage the risk that their countries could, to mitigate themselves. So again, things like terrorism and all this, they would use a similar scenario to try and
absolutely. So in my second, so we just had actually this was a risk conference at Cambridge related to the networks. One person on my panel was actually a professor who was working with the UK government, with the military, to actually reduce fatalities from IEDs. He ended up not being able to make the panel, but we had a great discussion. And what they've done was they basically used network theory to disrupt the terrorist networks. So they're looking at, okay, what materials, where do they get the materials from? How do they pay for them? So it was by disrupting the payment networks, by realizing how are they getting paid, and stopping that, they were able to reduce fatalities from these improvised explosive devices.
Like stopping the supply chain,
right?
you know.
Right, so there's a professor at the periphery who's never really served at the army, who's looking at these maps, saying, okay, let's look at all these interconnected maps and, you know, solving a problem on the battlefield.
That's made me think that maybe, in a way, for the different industries, you need someone almost from the outside.
Yeah. It
to
helps
give
a lot.
A new perspective to how things are happening, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's always more is better. The trick is how do you integrate all that when you have a lot of different perspectives. But we have such different governance methods now as well.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, think about, you know, governance from the Facebook perspective, right? Where you just realize certain message might resonate with a lot of people, and then the like-minded people get together and organize. So there's a lot that you can do from integrating different perspectives and social intelligence. So yeah, I think it makes sense to put together diverse teams from different fields, interdisciplinary fields that give different perspectives.
And also, hasn't it changed in terms of, it's much harder to regulate and control what is happening out there, even within your own borders, you know?
Absolutely.
So should they be, again, taking a different perspective, a different approach in terms of how they manage these risks?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's an issue with control, reducing volatility in the short run, right? For example, Thailand is thinking about having one internet highway now, one single lane to get it, because they want to control everything, right? And so you solve one problem, maybe, right? You can monitor, but the cascading effects from having too much rigidity are, you know, there'll be unanticipated effects from that. So this is a very common thing. A lot of countries, like, you know, especially, you know, say in the Middle East and in Russia, for example, where there's very little tolerance of, you know, free speech and like people, you know, protesting. By suppressing that and keeping the environment too stable, you risk more instability later. It's better to have opinions aired and discussed and open, as opposed to having the risk, you know, percolate in a hidden way, right? So this is this interesting thing as well now in world markets. Managed currencies are difficult because of that. The risk is actually not taken away. When all the European nations joined for the euro, it didn't eliminate FX risk. It simply suppressed it, where then it came out as, you know, Greece being imbalanced and other. So we need to be comfortable with a certain level of volatility to develop resilience. Too much, if you make the environment too stable, we optimize to that environment. I depend on the euro being exactly stable. And then when there's just a little change, the environment is so over-optimized. It's like a factory that's a precision factory. A little thing changes and the whole factory cascades, right?
Well, you know, you've made me a bit depressed, actually, because we painted this whole picture of how there's so many complications in the world. Everything's linked, so much so that there isn't really, well, there is no one size fits all. And it really is about finding the right balance for different countries, different cultures, different industries. Perhaps, as we wrap up now, share with us, you know, what you think is possibly the next best thing we could do at this point in time in this environment.
Right. I think it's going back to amplifying human-machine intelligence, right? That we work really well as teams. It helps to have different perspectives. And technology can help us do that. So I think the future really is in these mass collaboration platforms that connect us, that allow us to run experiments, right? That harness these two twin superpowers that we all have, right? We're all good at visual pattern recognition. Let's use that. Let's not have reams and reams of reports where people's eyes glaze over, right? And then let's display this as maps that help us navigate as a team and work together, right? So I think this is really important for creating a culture. I think a good culture of risk management, because it's really a cultural decision. If we all have more transparency about what these emerging risks are and can address them, right, and communicate about them, then we can act more effectively together, right? So the most important message I would like to leave is that there are certain things that make sense to do internally in our organization, data that we need to keep protected and private, but there's also some data that can help us better manage systemic risk, right? So there's certain kinds of risks that affect everyone, right? Climate change, ocean acidification, having another banking crisis. We should be sharing information, right, in a kind of a risk commons that we can use more. And I'm hoping, you know, we've had conversations with the BIS and IMF and other organizations. There's a lot of wonderful data, and there's a lot of fear to release data. Some data is confidential, but others, you know, it can be lagged data set, it can be anonymized data set, but there is a lot of information that scientists can look at and build maps on that can help us better navigate a much more challenging environment.
We need to be able to share that information and work
open
with
the right
each other.
data and let the right people look at it, right? And give people the tool, democratize these maps. Like, we should have maps showing us, risk in financial markets, just like we look at Google Maps, right? And that's one thing that we're aspiring to do at FNA as well. We have these maps that we're publishing. You can check my Twitter feed, which I'm publishing information on that. And I would love everyone to have maps like that available for free one day.
So that way we know if things are kind of heading in the wrong direction.
We can communicate. What's this big red dot? And why has the structure changed, right? Like, it's just asking questions and communicating, right? So that we're not, when there's a cascade, we're not running like headless chicken out of the crowded theater. We're looking at how the ball and the system is.
Although you do know Singapore's called the little red dot. But in a good way. We're called little red dot here in Singapore because when you look in the map, it's just a little speck.
And it's a very well managed
But Alan,
place.
it's been great. Thank you so much. I've learned so much. How did you become such a smart chap?
I've just always been curious in life and systems. I grew up in Germany with a German father, a Chinese mother, and I've always looked at different cultures and traveled around a lot. And for me, it's like different perspectives make the world richer, right? So it's just curiosity, curiosity about the world.
A pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much.
Good to meet you too, Steve. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Just speaking there with Alan Labouche, he's our first game changer, and I hope it's been insightful. I have learned so much. Join me tomorrow. I'll be back with other exciting guests from the world of finance. And of course, don't forget to tune in to Sibos Today with my colleague Nadine. She'll be coming in at 3:30 p.m. this afternoon, show you a few surprises as well. So goodbye. Enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.